The heavy steel door of his father's hidden safe groaned open, exhaling a gust of stale, cherry tobacco-scented air that hadn't been breathed in a decade. Mason pulled out a leather portfolio, his grease-stained fingers trembling as he untied the fraying twine. He expected to find the deed that would save his family's farm from the bank. Instead, he found a stack of secret contracts stamped in red. As his eyes scanned the jagged signatures at the bottom, the blood drained from his face. The land he had bled for wasn't just being taken. It had been sold years ago by the one person he trusted most. The roar of 3 black sedans tearing up the gravel driveway cut through the silence of the morning. Men in sharp suits stepped out, their polished shoes treading ruthlessly into the Wisconsin dirt Mason had spent his life tilling. One of them held up a tablet, his voice a cold, rhythmic drone as he announced that Mason had exactly 7 days to vanish before the bulldozers arrived. Mason gripped the porch railing until the wood splintered under his palm, watching the dust settle over his withered crops like ash. He wasn't just fighting a debt anymore. He was standing on a foundation built entirely on a lie. The pre-dawn mist clung to Mason Delaney's face, like a damp shroud, heavy with the scent of Wisconsin soil and the lingering tang of diesel. He crouched in the shadow of the barn, his fingers white-knuckled around a grease-slicked wrench. The old John Deere tractor sat before him like a stubborn beast of burden, its engine a labyrinth of rust and neglect. Mason set the tool against a seized bolt. He exhaled a sharp, ragged breath and threw his weight into the turn. The metal shrieked in protest, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the hollow timber of the structure, before the bolt finally surrendered. As it gave way, the wrench slipped, sending Mason's hand slamming into the frame. He hissed, the skin on his knuckles tearing away to reveal raw, red flesh. He didn't curse. He simply wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with a sleeve already stiffened by salt and oil. Looking down, he saw the empty oil canister lying on its side, a final drop of amber liquid oozing into the dirt. The engine was at the end of its life, much like his own endurance. Every strike of his hammer against the starter's solenoid felt like a bell tolling in the silence of the valley. Mason spat into the dust, the metallic taste of exhaustion thick on his tongue, and plunged back beneath the radiator's heat, desperate to coax one more hour of labor from the dead iron. Inside the kitchen, the morning light felt like an intrusion. It spilled across the scarred wooden table, illuminating the thick envelope that had arrived from the local bank. Mason turned the paper over in his hands, the elegant embossing of the return address feeling like a mockery of his calloused skin. The paper crinkled, a dry, rhythmic sound that filled the quiet room. He pulled the letter out, his eyes scanning the lines until they locked onto the cold, printed demand for immediate repayment. The figures, followed by a dizzying row of zeros, seemed to dance and blur into black smears against the white page. A leaden weight settled in his gut, turning to ice when he reached the phrase regarding the seizure of property within 48 hours. The sun outside continued to shine, indifferent to the ruin unfolding within these walls. Mason sank onto a chair, the old wood groaning under his frame as if sharing his burden. The air in the room grew thin, making every breath a conscious struggle. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm that mirrored the panic rising in his throat. This wasn't just a debt. It was an erasure of everything he had built. The hallway to his father's old study felt longer than usual, the shadows stretching to meet him. Mason pushed against the heavy oak door, the hinges offering a low, mournful creak. The air inside remained trapped in a different decade, smelling of stale dust and the pungent, cherry-scented tobacco his father had smoked until the day he died. Mason walked to the desk, his hand trailing over the surface and leaving a clean path through the gray film of time. Stacks of folders labeled property sat in disorganized heaps, and he began to tear through them, his movements growing more frantic with every passing second. The leather bindings of the books on the shelves felt unnaturally cold beneath his touch. He searched for the specific deed, the one with the golden seal that would prove the Delaney family still held the rights to these acres. Every rustle of parchment sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He emptied the drawers onto the faded rug, kneeling amidst a sea of yellowed receipts and old correspondence, praying to find the single sheet of paper that would serve as a shield in the coming legal storm. His fingers, numb from the cold and the stress, brushed against a slight irregularity in the wood paneling behind the desk. Mason paused, his pulse quickening. He gripped a loose edge of the wallpaper and ripped it away, revealing the dull gray steel of a hidden wall safe. From deep within his pocket, he retrieved the old key with the intricate bit, the one his father had worn on a leather cord around his neck for 30 years. The metal scraped against metal as he forced it into the keyhole, the sound grating on his nerves. He pressed his weight into the lever, but the mechanism remained frozen, seized by decades of disuse. Beads of sweat tracked through the grime on his temples, stinging his eyes. He tried again, his muscles bunching and trembling with the effort. An hour passed in that dim room, followed by another, the only sound being his ragged breathing and the stubborn clatter of the lock. Mason's jaw remained clamped shut, his teeth grinding together as he fought the unyielding iron, refusing to let the house keep its secrets any longer. A sharp, hollow click finally echoed through the room, and the safe door swung open. Mason reached inside, his hand trembling as he withdrew a single leather-bound portfolio tied shut with a fraying piece of twine. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers clumsy, until the contents spilled out onto his lap. His eyes darted over the pages, landing on dates from 10 years ago. Dates when his father was still alive, still supposedly in control. The scent of old ink, sharp and acidic, filled his nostrils. He flipped through contracts he had never seen, documents that had never been mentioned at the dinner table or during the long days in the fields. A tremor started in his hands and traveled up his arms as he noted the confidential stamps on the margins. With every paragraph he digested, the world he thought he knew began to dissolve. The steel box had held a web of transactions, a hidden history of the farm that had been festering under a layer of dust while he believed they were simply struggling against the weather. As he parsed the dense legal jargon, the blood drained from Mason's face, leaving him ghostly beneath the tan. The words were unmistakable. The land he had bled for, the soil that held his mother's roses and his father's sweat, was legally the property of Elias Thorne. The banker's signature sat at the bottom of every page, bold and predatory. Mason felt the floor beneath him become unsteady, the very foundation of his identity shifting. The Delaney legacy, 3 generations of pride, was nothing more than a fiction maintained for his benefit. He traced a finger over the purchase price, a sum so insultingly low, it felt like a physical blow. A spasm of hot, white fury tightened his throat, nearly choking him. He realized then that his entire life had been a staged play. A long-term deception designed to keep him working a land that had already been stolen from under his feet. At the very bottom of the final page, a signature caught his eye that made his heart stop. The name was written in a loose, familiar scrawl. Cole Delaney. His younger brother's name sat right next to Thorne's, a silent witness to the betrayal. Mason remembered the nights Cole had sat on the porch, promising to help keep the legacy alive, even as he was signing it away. The realization burned hotter than the loss of the land itself. He balled his fist, the edges of the contract crumpling under his grip, and he could almost see Cole's face in his mind, the easy smile that now seemed like a serpent's hiss. Every memory of them working side by side in the corn rows now felt tainted, a poisonous mockery of brotherhood. Mason closed his eyes, his stomach churning with a nausea that no medicine could cure. His own blood had sold him out for a handful of silver. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires pulled him back to the present. He stood and walked to the window, watching 3 black sedans pull up to the porch. Men in sharp, charcoal gray suits stepped out, led by a lawyer clutching a sleek tablet. Mason stepped onto the porch, his hand gripping the doorframe so hard the wood groaned. Thorne's people looked at him with the detached curiosity one might afford a dying animal. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his voice a dry drone as he began to read the formal notice of eviction. He pointed toward the boundary markers, his gestures clinical and precise. The wind whipped at the men's silk ties, a sharp contrast to Mason's frayed work jacket. As the lawyer spoke of rightful ownership and immediate vacation of premises, Mason's gaze drifted down to the man's polished Italian leather shoes. They were tilling the dirt of his ancestors, treading on the only thing Mason had left. And the urge to strike out, to feel bone break beneath his knuckles, was almost overwhelming. Mason took a heavy step forward, descending the porch stairs until he was mere inches from the lawyer's face. His voice didn't shake. It rumbled like a coming storm, low and dangerous, as he told the men to get off his land. The lawyer tried to thrust a photocopied deed toward Mason's chest, but Mason shoved the man's hand away with a violent jerk of his arm. The air between them grew thick with the sudden spike of adrenaline. Mason pointed a calloused finger toward the gate, reminding them that Wisconsin law still offered protections against summary eviction. The suits didn't move at first, their expressions hardening into masks of corporate indifference. But Mason didn't yield an inch. He stood his ground, a pillar of weathered oak, until the men finally retreated to their cars. He watched the sedans turn and speed away, the dust from their departure settling over his withered crops like ash. The silence that followed was broken an hour later by the shrill, persistent ring of the kitchen phone. Mason picked it up, expecting a bill collector. But instead, he heard the smooth, oily cadence of Elias Thorne. The banker spoke with a terrifying lack of emotion, reminding Mason that the eviction was a mathematical certainty. Mason gripped the receiver until the plastic casing began to crack and pop. Thorne offered a single week, 7 days of grace, before he would send the marshals to clear the house by force. The casual nature of the threat, delivered as if discussing the weather, sent a surge of white-hot rage through Mason's veins. He didn't respond, listening to the hollow click of the hang-up and the subsequent drone of the dial tone. A week. 7 days to fight a war that had been lost a decade ago. The deadline hung over the house like a guillotine blade, silver and sharp. Moving with a grim, mechanical efficiency, Mason went to his bedroom and pried up a loose floorboard beneath the bed. He tucked the portfolio of secret contracts into the dark space, the wood snapping back into place with a dull thud. He dragged a heavy woven rug over the spot, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The very walls of the house felt like they were closing in, the family photos on the mantel now looking like portraits of strangers and liars. The life he had known was a pile of embers, and the warmth was gone. He looked at a picture of himself and Cole as children, standing in front of the red barn, and he saw only the seed of the man who would eventually destroy him. The hollow ache in his chest began to solidify into a cold, calculating resolve. The Mason Delaney, who believed in fair play and blood ties, was dead. In his place stood a man with a scorched earth in his heart. He returned to the kitchen and cleared the table with a single sweep of his arm, sending a stack of unopened mail fluttering to the floor. He spread out a topographical map of the farm, the paper crinkling under his palms. He picked up a red marker, the ink bleeding into the paper as he circled the access roads and the gaps in Thorne's legal perimeter. His jaw was set so tight, his teeth ached. He focused on the names, Thorne, Cole, and began to sketch out a path of resistance. His mind moved with the precision of a predator, charting out every move, every potential counterstrike. He wasn't thinking about bankruptcy anymore, nor was he worried about the sheriff's deputies. He was thinking about survival and the price of betrayal. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Mason Delaney accepted the reality of his situation. He would stand his ground until the last bullet was spent and the last breath was drawn. The neon sign for the Rusty Nail flickered with a dying buzz as Mason pushed through the heavy doors. The air inside was a thick soup of stale cigarette smoke and the sharp, fermented tang of cheap whiskey. He didn't have to look long to find what he was after. Cole Delaney sat at the far end of the bar, his fingers curled around a glass of amber liquid, his eyes fixed on the reflected light in the mirror. Mason didn't say a word. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbed his brother by the collar of his leather jacket, and hauled him off the stool. With a violent heave, he threw Cole onto the sawdust-covered floor. The sound of the impact was a dull thud that silenced the jukebox. Mason stepped over him, his heavy work boot pinning Cole's chest to the boards. He pulled the crumpled, ink-stained documents from his pocket and shook them in Cole's face, the paper rattling like dry leaves. "Explain this," Mason growled, his voice a low vibration of pure malice. Cole gasped for air, his head pressed back against the dirt-streaked wood, while the rest of the bar patrons watched in frozen silence. Cole's hands came up to shield his face, his fingers trembling as he looked up at the shadow of his older brother. The bravado he usually wore had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, frightened shell. His voice came out as a pathetic wheeze, a confession born of terror. He spoke of nights in subterranean backrooms, of card games where the stakes rose faster than he could think. Thorne had been there, a silent vulture, buying up Cole's mounting debts until he owned the man entire. Cole began to sob, the sound wet and jagged as he described how Thorne had handed him the pen and the forged documents, forcing him to sign away the family's future to save his own skin. He admitted to helping Thorne pick apart the neighboring farms, acting as the inside man while Thorne moved in for the kill. Mason listened, and with every word, he felt the bond of their shared childhood snap. It wasn't just land Cole had sold. It was the very memory of their father. The following morning, Mason stood at the gas station pump, the cold wind biting at his neck. He slid his debit card into the slot of the ATM, his movements stiff. The screen flickered, a bright, mocking red, and displayed a message of transaction denied. He punched the buttons again, the plastic clicking under his forceful stabs. But the result remained the same. A final prompt appeared. Account frozen. Contact financial institution. He knew what it meant. Thorne's lawyers had moved with surgical precision, cutting off his access to every cent he had. Mason slammed his palm against the metal casing of the machine, the vibration ringing up his arm. In the back of his truck, the fuel tank was nearly dry, and back at the farm, the cattle were lowing for feed he couldn't buy. Thorne was starving him out, turning his own resources into weapons against him. He was back at the farm gate when he saw the dust cloud approaching. It was Mr. Grady's grain truck, the familiar rumble of the engine, usually a sound of relief. Mason stepped out into the road, raising a hand to signal the old man. But the truck didn't slow down. It came to a jarring halt 20 feet away, the engine idling with a heavy, rhythmic throb. Grady didn't get out. He sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering column, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance behind Mason. Through the open window, Grady's voice was a frantic whisper. He spoke of a phone call from Thorne's office, a threat to burn his silos to the ground if a single bushel of grain reached the Delaney property. Without another word, Grady slammed the truck into reverse, the tires spitting gravel as he spun the heavy vehicle around. Mason stood alone in the settling dust, the smell of exhaust lingering in the air, watching his last hope for the herd disappear over the hill. The sun had just dipped below the tree line when the smell reached him. Not the sweet scent of hay, but the acrid, oily stench of accelerant. Mason turned toward the hayloft, just as a flash of orange erupted from the gaps in the siding. He ran, his boots thudding against the packed earth, but he was too late. A sudden, muffled explosion of vaporized gasoline blew out the support beams, and a pillar of fire roared into the evening sky. The heat was a physical wall, singeing his eyebrows and turning the air into a shimmering haze. The dry alfalfa inside acted like tinder, the flames climbing the rafters with a terrifying, hungry roar. Through the smoke, Mason caught a glimpse of a dark figure darting into the woods. But a loud crack of timber drew his attention back to the barn. The roof was beginning to sag, and the sparks were already drifting toward the main house like a swarm of fireflies. Mason didn't hesitate. He dived into the cowshed adjacent to the burning loft, the air inside already thick and gray. The cows were screaming, a sound of pure, primal terror that clawed at his ears. He lunged for the main doors, but the heat had warped the frame, and the heavy crossbar was jammed tight. He threw his shoulder into the wood, the impact jarring his entire skeleton. Again and again he hit the door, his skin blistering from the radiant heat of the inferno next door. On the fourth hit, the hinges shrieked and gave way. He hauled the door open, and the herd surged forward, a chaotic mass of hide and bone. He was nearly trampled, his back scraping against the splintered wood as the animals bolted for the safety of the dark fields. He pulled a wet rag over his face, his vision blurring from the smoke, and stumbled out into the night air just as the loft collapsed into a heap of glowing charcoal. The rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights illuminated the charred ruins an hour later. Sheriff Miller stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching on the wet ash. He didn't look at the smoking debris or the scorched earth. He looked at Mason, who was sitting on the bumper of his truck, trying to wipe the soot from his eyes. Miller didn't ask if he was okay. He leaned against his car, the light from his flashlight blinding Mason as he spoke of insurance fraud and desperate men doing desperate things. Mason tried to point toward the woods, toward the smell of gasoline that still hung in the air. But Miller just smirked and made a note in his ledger. It was a performance, a scripted interaction. Mason realized then that the law in this county wasn't a shield. It was a leash, and Elias Thorne held the handle. He spent the next few hours walking to the neighboring farms, his legs heavy with leaden fatigue. He knocked on the Miller's door, but the porch light clicked off before he could reach the stairs. He went to the Hendersons, but the curtains were drawn tight, and the only sound was the heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding into place. Cole had done his work well, spreading the poison that Mason had lost his mind, that he was dangerous, that he had set the fire himself in a fit of debt-induced rage. These were people he had helped during floods, people whose children he had watched grow, and now they were treating him like a leper. He walked back down his long driveway, the silence of the countryside feeling like a physical weight. The community he thought he belonged to had vanished, replaced by a wall of cold, calculated silence. The morning brought a new kind of horror. Toby came running out of the house, his face a mask of tear-streaked terror, clutching a formal document with the state seal. Mason took the paper, his hands shaking as he read the summons from Child Protective Services. It cited unstable living conditions and the imminent danger of the recent fire as grounds for an emergency removal of the child. The signature at the bottom belonged to Judge Whitaker, a man who played golf with Thorne every Sunday. Mason pulled Toby into a fierce embrace, feeling the boy's small frame shudder against him. Thorne wasn't just taking the land. He was reaching for the only thing that gave Mason a reason to keep breathing. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, a calculated strike designed to break his will once and for all. As the sun began to climb, the faint hum of the refrigerator suddenly died, and the house fell into an eerie, unnatural quiet. Mason walked out onto the porch and saw the power lines hanging limp from the pole, the copper wires severed with surgical precision. He picked up the kitchen phone. The line was dead. No power, no water pump, no way to call for help. In the distance, near the edge of the woods, he heard the low rumble of a truck engine and a burst of mocking laughter. Thorne's men were circling, cutting the ties to the world one by one. The house, once a sanctuary of light and warmth, was becoming a tomb. He sat in the living room as the shadows lengthened, the silence so absolute he could hear the ticking of his own heart. By the time the next dawn broke, a patrol car was parked across the end of his driveway. When Mason tried to pull his truck out to go for supplies, a deputy stepped out and leveled a finger at him. He was told he was under investigative detention regarding the fire and was forbidden from leaving the property. The deputy's hand rested casually on the grip of his sidearm, a silent warning that the perimeter was no longer a suggestion. Mason looked past the cruiser and saw the dark shapes of men moving through the trees. Thorne's private security, hired to ensure the trap remained closed. He was a prisoner on his own dirt, watching the clock tick down toward the final hour. He went to the floorboards and retrieved his father's old double-barrel shotgun. The metal was cold, smelling of oil and old hunts. He broke the action, sliding 2 heavy buckshot shells into the chambers with a mechanical click that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. He dragged a chair to the window overlooking the road, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. Toby was asleep on a pile of blankets at his feet, his breathing shallow and fitful. Mason laid the gun across his lap and watched the mist rise off the fields. He didn't feel fear anymore, only a cold, crystalline clarity. The bulldozers would come with the sun, and he would be waiting. The drainage pipe was a narrow, rib-crushing tunnel of corrugated steel, and Mason Delaney was currently halfway through it. The smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation was a physical weight in the cramped space, making every breath a struggle against the urge to gag. He moved on his hands and knees, the cold slime of the pipe's floor soaking through his work pants. Above him, the muffled thud of heavy boots on the soil told him the deputies were still patrolling the perimeter of the house. He froze when his palm came down on a sharp piece of jagged stone, the pain lancing up his arm. But he didn't make a sound. He waited, his heart thundering against the steel walls, until the footsteps faded. He pushed forward again, toward the faint circle of gray light at the end of the line. When he finally emerged into the tall grass of the back pasture, the air felt like a miracle, tasting of wet clover and freedom. The city was a different kind of wilderness. Mason pressed his back against the cold brick of the office building, his eyes scanning the alley for any sign of Thorne's security. He held the steel pry bar in his hand, the metal icy against his skin. He found the rear door of Cole's law office and wedged the tool into the frame. The wood groaned, a sharp, splintering sound that seemed to echo for miles in the quiet street. He paused, his pulse racing, listening for the scream of a siren, but only the wind answered. With one final, violent heave, the lock mechanism shattered, the metal parts clattering onto the carpet inside. Mason slipped into the darkened office, the air smelling of expensive cologne and the paper-dry scent of legal files. He closed the door behind him, the shadows of the room swallowing him whole, and set to work. A small penlight illuminated the interior of Cole's floor safe, the beam dancing over stacks of cash and neatly organized folders. Mason ignored the money. His fingers closed around a small plastic case containing several micro-cassettes. He pulled a portable recorder from his pocket and slid the first tape in. The voice that emerged was unmistakable. Elias Thorne, his tone stripped of its public charm, threatening to break Cole's legs if the interest on his gambling debts wasn't paid by Monday. Mason's jaw tightened as he flipped through a stack of promissory notes, some of them marked with dark, dried stains that could only be blood. Each document was a confession, a map of the corruption that had hollowed out his family. He stuffed the tapes and the papers into his jacket, the weight of the evidence feeling like armor. The sudden glare of a spotlight hit the office window, turning the room into a stark landscape of white light and long, jagged shadows. Mason heard the heavy thud of a vehicle door and the unmistakable bark of a radio. He didn't have time to use the door. He lunged for the second-story window, throwing the sash up so hard the glass rattled in the frame. He dived out, the cold night air rushing past him for a terrifying second before he hit the branches of a large lilac bush. The wood snapped and tore at his skin, but it broke his fall. He hit the ground and rolled, his shoulders screaming in protest. Behind him, the sound of breaking glass and shouting men filled the alley. He didn't look back. He scrambled over a chain-link fence and vanished into the darkness of the neighboring garden, the scent of crushed blossoms and ozone filling his lungs. He reached the old pickup he had stashed in the woods 2 miles away and floored the accelerator. The gravel of the back roads drummed against the undercarriage like a hail of bullets. In his rearview mirror, 2 sets of high beams appeared, weaving wildly as they gained ground. Thorne's mercenaries were better equipped, their SUVs roaring as they ate up the distance. Mason gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he pushed the old truck past its limits. The world outside was a blur of dark trees and gray road. A heavy jolt rocked the truck as the lead SUV rammed his rear bumper, the sound of crumpling metal loud in the cabin. He tried to swerve, to lose them in the tight turns of the forest road. But another hit sent the back end of the truck sliding toward the edge of the ravine. The world tilted on its axis as the truck left the road. Mason saw the treetops revolving past the windshield, a kaleidoscope of green and black. There was a deafening screech of metal on rock as the vehicle tumbled down the embankment, finally coming to a jarring halt against the trunk of a massive white pine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of steam from the radiator. Mason's head throbbed, a warm, sticky fluid trickling down his forehead and stinging his left eye. He kicked the driver's side door open, the metal groaning as it yielded. He fell into the ferns, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Above him, on the road, he heard the SUV doors slam and the harsh shouts of men. He forced himself upright, his vision swimming, and disappeared into the thick undergrowth, leaving a trail of dark spots on the moss. He lay flat on his stomach in a bed of rotting leaves, his heart hammering against the earth. Through the dense screen of pines, he watched the silhouette of Sheriff Miller standing at the edge of the ravine, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Miller's voice was cold, devoid of the neighborly warmth he used to fake at the diner. He told the men to shoot to kill if they saw any movement in the brush, claiming Mason was armed and dangerous. Mason bit his lip to keep from crying out as a sharp pain flared in his side. The metallic glint of the rifles in the moonlight was a grim reminder that he was no longer a citizen in their eyes. He was a loose end. He watched as the men began to descend the slope, their movements methodical and predatory. By the time the sky began to turn to a bruised purple, Mason reached an abandoned hunting shack deep in the woods. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp needle duff and old wood smoke. On a rough-hewn table, he found a discarded flyer, likely blown in through a broken pane. It was an announcement for an emergency town hall meeting at the courthouse, scheduled for 8 in the morning. Thorne was going to finalize the land transfer in front of the community. Mason looked at his shattered watch. He had less than 3 hours. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was it, the only chance to bring the truth to light. His gaze hardened, the exhaustion and the fever receding behind a wall of pure, focused intent. Back at the farm, the front door was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered by a battering ram. Social workers and deputies swarmed the house, their flashlights illuminating the empty hallway. They burst into Toby's room, but the bed was cold. The only occupant, a small, worn teddy bear left on the pillow. Thorne's men searched the barn and the outbuildings, their voices echoing in the empty structures. Mason had planned for this. He had moved Toby to Mr. Grady's farm hours ago, hiding the boy in a concealed root cellar beneath the floor of the grain silo. Toby sat in the dark, clutching an old battery-operated radio, waiting for the signal his father had promised. Mason knew Grady would hold his ground. The old man had nothing left to lose but his soul. In the dim light of the shack, Mason stripped off his blood-soaked shirt. The gash in his side was deep, the edges ragged and angry. He found a spool of heavy fishing line and a rusted upholstery needle in a drawer. He bit down on a piece of pine bark, the bitter taste of resin filling his mouth, and made the first stitch. The pain was an explosion of white light behind his eyes, making his entire body convulse. He didn't stop. He pushed the needle through the skin, pulling the line tight, his breath coming in short, animalistic grunts. Sweat poured off him, stinging the raw wounds on his face. When the final knot was tied, he slumped against the wall, his vision blurring. He stayed there for 10 minutes, his body trembling with shock, before he forced himself back onto his feet. The swamp was a nightmare of waist-deep mud and tangled roots. Mason moved through the reeds, the foul water stinging his fresh stitches. He could see the lights of the town in the distance, but the bridge was blocked by a patrol car, its engine idling. He had to go the long way, through the black heart of the marsh. Every step was a battle against the suction of the mud. Leeches clung to his legs, and the cold seeped into his bones. But he kept moving. He was a ghost in the water, a fragment of the land itself rising up to reclaim what was stolen. As he finally reached the outskirts of the town, his body was a map of pain, but his mind was a single, sharpened blade. The back of the town hall smelled of wet cardboard and the sour, fermented scent of old trash. Mason moved through the shadows of the alley, his boots silent on the damp pavement. He reached the heavy iron fire door and set his shoulder against it. With a sharp metallic pop, the latch gave way. Inside, the building hummed with the amplified voice of Elias Thorne, the sound echoing through the corridors like a sermon. Mason could feel the floor vibrate under the thunderous applause of the crowd in the main hall. He gripped the handle of the inner door, his knuckles white, as Thorne spoke of progress and the inevitable march of the market. Mason took a long, shaky breath, the pain in his side a dull, rhythmic throb, and stepped into the light. The oak doors of the assembly hall swung open with a crash that silenced the room instantly. Mason Delaney stood in the entrance, his frame swaying slightly as he leaned against the wood for support. He was a vision of ruin. His clothes were torn and caked with swamp mud, and a dark, dried crust of blood covered half his face. The opulent interior of the hall, with its white linens and polished brass, seemed to shrink away from his presence. Elias Thorne froze mid-sentence at the lectern, the glass of water in his hand trembling until the contents spilled over his knuckles. Mason's voice was a low, guttural rasp that carried to the very back of the hall, demanding silence. The townspeople stared, their whispers dying in their throats as they looked upon the man they had once called a neighbor, now looking like a specter of vengeance. Mason began the long walk down the center aisle, his steps heavy and uneven. He reached the long table where the town council sat and slammed a black digital recorder onto the polished mahogany. Beside it, he threw the blood-stained folders and the crumpled promissory notes. He didn't look away from Thorne, his hand pressing down on the evidence to keep it from being swept aside. The council members recoiled, the scent of the marsh and the iron tang of blood filling the air around them. Mason's hand was steady as he spread the documents out, revealing the signatures and the stamps that Thorne had tried so hard to bury. The silence in the hall was absolute, save for the frantic, shallow breathing of the man behind the podium. The sound that followed was the high-pitched whine of a tape being played. Thorne's voice, stripped of its oily veneer, filled the hall. It was a recording of a backroom deal, the banker's words cold and predatory as he detailed the bribes paid to the sheriff and the systematic destruction of the Delaney legacy. A woman in the front row gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she heard Thorne laugh about the inevitability of the farmer's ruin. Thorne lunged for the recorder, his face a mask of purple rage. But Mason's arm was a bar of iron, blocking his path. The recording played on, a litany of crimes that turned the air in the room sour. The townspeople looked at one another, the realization of their own betrayal dawning in their eyes. Thorne's composure shattered. He began to scream at Sheriff Miller, his voice a shrill command to arrest the trespasser and thief. Miller stepped forward, his hand moving toward his holster, but he was stopped by a wall of bodies. Old Man Grady and a dozen other farmers had stood up, their faces grim and unyielding, forming a human barrier between Mason and the law. Miller looked at the crowd, then at his deputies, who were staring at the floor, refusing to meet his gaze. The authority that Thorne had bought and paid for was evaporating in the heat of the town's collective anger. The hall was no longer a place of order. It was a tinderbox, and the match had been struck. From the shadows behind the stage, Cole Delaney emerged. He looked smaller than he had 2 days ago, his expensive suit hanging off his frame. Mason turned to look at his brother, and for a long moment, no words were spoken. Mason held out his hand, his palm upturned and stained with the very soil Cole had sold. It was a silent invitation, a final chance to choose blood over greed. Cole looked at the hand, then at the faces of the people he had helped ruin. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Cole took a step forward, his eyes brimming with a shame that no amount of money could ever wash away. Mason spoke then, his voice low and vibrating with a grief that moved the entire room. He didn't talk about the money or the debt. He talked about their father's hands, about the way the light hit the valley in October, and about the promises made to the dead. He spoke of the Delaney name and the weight of the dirt that covered their ancestors. Cole's shoulders began to shake as he listened to the history of their life, a history he had tried to erase for the sake of a few gambling markers. The townspeople watched, the drama of the two brothers eclipsing the legal battle. Mason was calling his brother back from the edge of a cliff, and the whole world was holding its breath. Cole's voice broke the silence, starting as a whisper and rising to a firm, clear declaration. He turned toward the council and began to testify, his words a flood of confession. He admitted to the forgeries, the secret meetings, and the systematic harassment of the neighbors. He detailed how Thorne had held the debt over his head like a sword, forcing him to act as the architect of his own family's destruction. Thorne collapsed into his chair, the arrogance drained from him, leaving behind a hollow, frightened old man. Mason closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek. The truth was out, and though it had cost them everything, the lie was finally dead. The ghoul of the crowd turned into a roar of condemnation. Sheriff Miller, realizing the tide had turned irrevocably, unbuckled his duty belt, and let it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. He walked over to Thorne's security team and demanded their weapons. The sound of rifles and handguns being surrendered was the final knell for Thorne's empire. Miller retrieved a pair of handcuffs and approached the podium, clicking them onto Thorne's wrists. The banker didn't fight. He just stared at the floor, a broken shell of a man. As he was led out of the hall, the townspeople stood in silence, watching the man who had owned them being taken away in chains. A state representative stepped forward, his face solemn as he looked at the documents on the table. He spoke to Mason, his voice carrying through the quiet hall. He explained that due to the complexity of the forgeries and the outstanding debts, the large pastures would have to be sold to the state to settle the accounts. However, he laid a hand on the deed to the home and the immediate acreage. He told Mason that the house, the barn, and the land they stood on were his, clear and free of any claim. It wasn't the whole farm, but it was the heart of it. Mason looked at the paper, the ink a promise of a future, and felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. In the quiet of the hallway after the meeting, Cole stood before Mason one last time. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, the keys to the old family truck he had taken. He placed them on the table next to Mason and turned away. He walked toward the exit, his silhouette framed by the morning light, and disappeared into the street. Mason watched him go, the keys cold in his hand. There was no joy in the victory, only a quiet, somber peace. The brother he had grown up with was gone, but the land remained. Mason stepped out onto his porch as the sun fully rose over the horizon. Toby was there, his small hand slipping into Mason's. They looked out over the fields that were no longer theirs to plant, but were no longer thorns to steal. The silence of the morning was different now. It was the silence of a new beginning. Mason looked down at his son and saw the future, a life built on a foundation of truth rather than a legacy of lies. He took a deep breath of the cold Wisconsin air and, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. They stood there together, father and son, as the world began to wake up around them.